The state broadcasts of the Core Hegemony always begin with a symphony. It is a triumphant, synthesized arrangement of chords designed to evoke structural perfection, total dominance, and the clean, sterile beauty of an ordered galaxy. On the golden screens of 100 civilized worlds, the image of High Archon Xyler materialized. His multifaceted eyes gleamed under the soft illumination of the capital spires, his iridescent robes draped over a chassis that had never known the dirt of an unterraformed planet. Citizens, the Archon's translated voice floated across the subspace networks, smooth and melodic. Today we mark the semi-centennial anniversary of the Great Stabilization. 50 solar cycles ago, the hegemony encountered the species-designated terrestrial sapient, the humans of the Sol system. They were a violent, unruly anomaly. A species that refused the math of the core, that weaponized radioactive isotopes within their own atmosphere, and threatened the grand equilibrium of our expansion. The screen shifted, displaying old, grainy archival footage of a pale blue world turning black, its oceans boiling away into gray steam under the concentrated heat of 100 orbital thermal lances. They were an evolutionary error, Xyler continued, his tone carrying the casual indifference of a clerk describing a cleared ledger. A species too stubborn to submit, too primitive to integrate. And so, the core exercised its sovereign right of erasure. In 3 solar rotations the Sol system was quieted. The human threat was permanently neutralized. Today we celebrate 50 cycles of total peace. The universe is clean. The humans are extinct. 3 billion miles away, past the dead irradiated rock that had once been Mars, past the shattered rings of Saturn, deep within the freezing pitch-black clutter of the Oort Cloud, a light flickered. It wasn't a biological light. It was the dim amber glow of a vacuum tube terminal inside the command deck of the SS Gerion. The Gerion did not look like a ship. To any alien sensor array passing the outer rim of the system, it would have registered as nothing more than an elongated, iron-rich asteroid, frozen to near absolute zero, drifting aimlessly through the ice fields. Its hull was wrapped in 4 meters of crushed meteoric slag, masking the hyperdense, black titanium combat frame beneath. Inside the central CIC, the air was cold enough that a man's breath hung before his face in stiff, ghostly clouds. No heaters were active. No primary power lines hummed. Admiral Jacob Cole sat in his mechanical restraint chair, his eyes fixed on the text scrolling across the amber monitor. The broadcast from the Core Hegemony was being received via a passive, subspace quantum antenna, a device that consumed less electricity than a wristwatch. He was 68 years old. He had been 18 when the sky burned. His skin was the color of old parchment, his hands mapped with the pale white scars of deep space frostbite. He took a slow, deliberate breath, watching his own exhalation drift toward the terminal. 50 years, Cole murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like rocks grinding together in a dry riverbed. They're still throwing themselves a parade. Beside him in the dim shadows, Chief Engineer Reyes leaned against the structural bulkhead, his fingers idly spinning a heavy mechanical wrench. His grease-stained thermal suit was patched at the elbows with industrial tape. "Let him dance, Admiral," Reyes muttered, his teeth clicking together against the chill. "The longer they think we're dust, the longer we have to finish the work." The shipyard arrays in Sector 9 just reported the 3rd dreadnought frame is fully plated. "We're maintaining total thermal zero across the entire belt. We're playing a dangerous game of poker with a dead hand, Reyes," Cole said, turning his head toward the massive, dark view screen at the front of the deck. The screen was inactive, showing only the distorted reflection of the skeletal crew sitting in the dark. "If they send one deep-scan scout patrol 3 degrees off the standard trade transit lane, our shadow vanishes." As if the universe had been listening for the vulnerability, a high-pitched, rhythmic chime began to pulse from the passive sensor console. It wasn't the smooth cadence of a natural cosmic signal. It was the sharp, mechanical tick of an active tachyonic ping. The crew went instantly rigid. The casual murmuring of the deck watch died in a fraction of a second. A young sensor officer, her face illuminated only by the faint green phosphorescence of her radar sweep, spoke in a tight, breathless whisper. "Admiral, we have a transient contact. Outbound from the slipstream terminal near Jupiter's shadow. It's a Sovereignty Border Patrol vessel. A Swift-class corvette." Cole didn't move. His heart rate didn't spike. 50 years of living like a ghost had stripped the panic out of his blood. "Trajectory?" "They're running a random grid sweep, sir," she whispered, her fingers hovering over the dead keys, refusing to press them to avoid generating a microvolt of electrical noise. "They just dropped an active ping. It's bouncing off the ice field, 4,000 kilometers from our current position. If they hold this course, their passive thermal arrays will hit our hull profile in 4 minutes. They're looking for smuggler relays, Reyes growled, his grip tightening on the wrench until his knuckles turned white. If they find us, they don't even have to fight. One tight beam subspace transmission back to the hegemony capital, and 300 orbital cruisers will be sitting on our heads before the week is out. The bluff fails. Cole leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in the amber gloom. The sovereignty thought the universe was empty. They thought the sector was a graveyard. They had no idea that deep within the ice, the ghosts were watching them through the scope of a loaded rifle. "Breathe small, people," Cole said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, level whisper that cut through the freezing air of the deck. "Turn off the emergency displays. Cut the life support scrubbers. We go to absolute cold status. If we bleed 1 watt of heat into the dark, we die." The lights on the amber terminal winked out. The command deck of the last human flagship plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. The darkness inside the command deck was absolute, heavy, and freezing. When you turn off the life support scrubbers on a 90,000-ton warship, the universe reminds you very quickly that space is a vacuum looking for a way in. The air turned stale within 90 seconds, tasting of old copper, sweat, and the faint, chemically sweet tang of recycled oxygen. No one moved. No one spoke. The 23 men and women on the bridge of the SS Gerion sat like statues in their restraint harnesses, their eyes strained against the blackness, listening to the structural groans of a ship pretending to be a dead rock. Through the forward observation ports, thick panes of reinforced synthetic quartz, the alien corvette appeared. It was a beautiful, predatory thing, sleek and white like a carved bone, its hull glowing with the soft, iridescent blue lines of an active anti-gravity propulsion field. It drifted through the floating mountain range of ice chunks with a slow, arrogant grace. It didn't have its combat shields raised. Why would it? This was a graveyard. The sovereignty had cleared this sector 50 years ago. A tiny green indicator light, the only active display on the entire human bridge, began to pulse rhythmically on the engineering console. Reyes leaned close to Cole, his voice a breathy whisper that barely carried across the 2 feet of space between their chairs. "Core temperature in the internal heat sinks is hitting 82 degrees Celsius, Admiral. We're cooking." Human stealth in the deep dark wasn't accomplished by space magic or light-bending cloaks. The laws of thermodynamics were absolute. If you run a nuclear reactor or if you have 23 warm bodies breathing inside a steel box, you generate infrared radiation. You generate heat. The sovereignty's passive sensors could pick up a thermal leak from a billion kilometers away against the near-absolute zero background of open space. To hide, the Gerion didn't radiate its heat outward. It trapped it. Every joule of thermal energy generated by the ship's minimal electronics and the crew's bodies was pumped into massive blocks of liquid lithium buried deep within the ship's armored core. But a heat sink is a sponge. Eventually it gets full. "The lithium arrays are saturated," Reyes whispered, a bead of sweat rolling down his forehead and freezing instantly on his collar. "In 4 minutes, the heat is going to start bleeding through the outer hull plating. The ship will light up on their scopes like a flare in a dark room. We have to vent, or we have to turn the cooling systems back on and boil ourselves." "We do neither," Cole said, his eyes tracking the white bone hull of the alien corvette. It was less than 2 kilometers away now, close enough that the blue wash of its anti-gravity drive was casting eerie, rippling shadows across the Gerion's dead bridge. "Reyes, what's the status on the auxiliary docking clamps?" Reyes paused, his mind working through the engineering schematics in the dark. "They're mechanical, sir. Spring-loaded. Cold storage. They don't require power to release." "Good," Cole said. He unbuckled his harness, his boots clicking softly against the deck as the low-intensity artificial gravity plates, running on their last residual voltage, held him down. "We aren't going to shoot them. A missile launch or a mass driver spike would create a thermal signature they'd transmit before we could impact. We're going to catch them." He turned toward the shadow where the Marine detachment sat in the dark. "Major Vance, get your team into the hard suits. No thrusters. No active HUDs. You use the mechanical cold gas tethers only." The silence in the room broke with the low, rhythmic clack-clack of magnetic boots moving down the access corridor. The alien corvette drifted closer, its search arrays sweeping a massive block of water ice directly adjacent to the Gerion. The alien crew had no idea that the irregular, slag-covered asteroid sitting right next to them wasn't a chunk of planetary crust. Deep within the Gerion's underbelly, a heavy, spring-loaded hatch compressed. There was no hiss of escaping air, The boarding lock had been manually depressurized to a vacuum hours before. 6 human Marines, encased in bulky, matte black kinetic combat suits that absorbed 99% of all incoming light, drifted out into the void. They didn't use active jetpacks. They didn't turn on their targeting computers. They were linked together by a single high-tensile carbon fiber line, moving through the weightless dark like spiders floating on threads of silk. Vance fired a mechanical, compressed gas spear gun. The magnetic tip sailed silently through the 200 meters of open space, attaching itself to the underbelly of the alien corvette with a dull, vibrationless thump that the alien internal dampeners easily swallowed as space debris. One by one, the Marines hauled themselves along the tether, their black boots making contact with the smooth, white hull of the Sovereignty ship. On the bridge of the Gerion, Cole watched through a primitive, optical periscope. The green light on the engineering board was flashing faster now. 89 degrees. The outer hull plates were beginning to warm. "They're on the hull," Cole murmured. "Vance, you have 90 seconds before we light up their radar." Through the periscope, Cole saw a sudden sharp flash of chemical green light on the alien ship's maintenance airlock. The Marines hadn't used a plasma torch. They had used a primitive high-velocity thermite paste, a chemical reaction that burned intensely hot but completely contained its own oxygen supply, melting through the alien sealing rings in 5 seconds flat. The airlock door was wrenched open by raw hydraulic human force. The black shapes of the Marines slipped inside, disappearing into the bright, iridescent blue corridors of the Sovereignty Scout. For 60 seconds the universe went entirely still. Then the white bone corvette shivered. Its external navigation lights flickered, the smooth blue lines of its anti-gravity drive sputtering and shifting into a violent, erratic yellow. The ship lurched to the left, its active sensor array suddenly swinging away from the ice field and pointing harmlessly into the empty void. The passive radio link in Cole's earpiece gave a single short click. "Bridge secure," Vance's voice came through, cold, brutal, and breathing hard. "No transmissions went out, Admiral. We caught them at the console. They thought we were ghosts." Cole let out a long, slow breath, watching the frost disappear from his lips as he reached down and slammed the primary power overrides. "Reyes, spin up the reactor," Cole ordered, his voice rising over the sudden, magnificent roar of the Gerion's main engines coming back to life. "Vent the heat sinks directly into the alien's engine exhaust. Let the galaxy think that corvette just had a thruster malfunction. And bring that alien commander to my ready room. It's time to find out what they're doing in our graveyard." The air inside the Gerion's ready room was thick with the scent of cheap chicory coffee and old insulation. Power had been restored, but only to a low, amber twilight. Across the bolted-down steel table sat Commander Inari. His physical frame was typical of the Sovereignty's ruling caste, slender, elongated limbs covered in smooth, pale gray chitin, and a head defined by large, glossy black eyes that reflected the dim room like oil pools. He didn't have hands. He had delicate, multi-jointed manipulators that were currently trembling against the high-tensile plastic zip ties securing him to the chair. Admiral Cole sat opposite him, holding a stained ceramic mug. He hadn't washed his face. The soot from the engine deck was smeared across his cheek like old camo paint. "Your translation matrix is working," Cole said, his voice a low, level rasp. "So let's skip the part where you pretend you don't understand me." Inari's vocal mandibles clicked rapidly, producing a high-pitched, synthesized voice through the small device the Marines had slapped onto his collar. This isn't statistical impossibility. The human species was itemized. The Sol system was sterilized 50 cycles ago. The records are absolute. The records are what we let you write," Cole said, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "When your fleet showed up 50 years ago with those thermal lances, we knew we couldn't beat you in a straight fight. Our shields were non-existent, our ships were too slow. So we played dead. We detonated our own cobalt reserves in the upper atmosphere, we flooded the local spectrum with radiation, and we made Earth look like a burning, radioactive rock before your lances even finished firing. We gave your bureaucrats exactly what they wanted to see, a clean ledger." Inari's glossy eyes shifted, trying to look past Cole toward the dark corridor outside. "A temporary reprieve. The hegemony spans 3 sectors. If you have survived in the ice, you are a handful of parasites hiding in a tomb. When the High Core learns of this, they won't learn a damn thing from you," Reyes cut in from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his grease-stained chest. He held a small, glowing data crystal between his fingers, the extracted core from the alien corvette's navigation computer. "Admiral, I just pulled their military logistics log. They weren't patrolling for smugglers. This scout was part of an advanced screen for the main Armada. Cole didn't look up from his mug. Where is the Armada heading, Reyes? The Vanguard sector, Reyes said, his voice dropping all trace of its usual cynical humor. The Sovereignty is moving 90 dreadnoughts and 12 planetary seekers toward the Calith worlds. The campaign starts in 3 solar days. They're going to do to them exactly what they thought they did to us. The room went entirely silent, save for the low, rhythmic thumping of the Geriant's secondary fuel pumps. Inari's posture shifted, his gray chitin stiffening with a sudden, arrogant pride. The Calith are an unoptimized species. They resist integration into the Core's economic calculus. Like humanity, their elimination is mathematically required for the stabilization of the arm. You cannot stop it. Your single, crude vessel cannot alter the trajectory of an empire. Cole slowly set his mug down on the steel table. The metal clinked against the surface with a heavy, final sound. He looked at Inari, and for the first time, a small, terrifying smile touched the corners of the old man's mouth. You think this is our only ship? Cole said softly. He stood up, his joints popping in the low gravity, and walked over to the terminal on the wall. He punched in a manual command code, bypassing the stealth protocols that had kept the Oort Cloud dark for half a century. Commander, humanity didn't spend 50 years hiding in the dark because we were afraid of your empire, Cole said, his voice echoing hollowly through the small room. We hid because we needed time to build. We needed 50 years of unmonitored mining, 50 years of automated manufacturing, and 50 years of breeding a generation of kids who grew up in the freezing dark, listening to the story of how their grandparents' world burned. He slammed his palm against the terminal's execution key. Outside the Gerian, deep within the hollowed-out bellies of 7 different icebound asteroids that the Sovereignty had catalogued as worthless debris, the lights came on. Massive, mile-long hangar doors made of raw, unpainted iron began to grind open. The internal heaters of 7 hidden naval foundries cycled into the red, venting columns of vapor into the vacuum. From the dark recesses of the ice emerged shapes, not sleek, white bone like the alien ships, but massive, slab-sided, brutalist blocks of black titanium. Dreadnoughts, carriers, heavy kinetic cruisers. Each one bore a name painted in stark white letters across their prow. SS Agamemnon, SS Leviathan, SS Dreadnought. Not one ship. Not a dozen. An armada of 342 heavy warships, built out of pure, unadulterated human spite, drifted out into the freezing void, their massive fusion cores igniting like an artificial constellation of angry blue stars. Inari's mandibles clicked frantically, his eyes widening as his biological sensors tried to process the sheer volume of high-mass signatures suddenly lighting up his captured ship's display. This factory capacity, it is undetected, it violates the sector's resource allocation math. We're done with your math, Cole said, turning back to face the trembling alien. We've been playing the extinction bluff for 50 years, Commander. And we just decided to call your bet. He looked at Reyes. Tell the fleet to drop their stealth baffles. Spin up the slipstream drives. Target coordinates, the Sovereignty staging ground at the Calith border. Cole leaned down, his face inches from Inari's blind, black eyes. You told the galaxy we were dead, son. Now you get to find out what we brought back from the grave. The slipstream corridor was not a place of light. It was a violet, churning tunnel of high-pressure gravity that compressed the Geriant's forward hull until the heavy titanium beams shrieked like dying animals. For 12 hours, 342 black-painted warships ran through the belly of the subspace dimension, their crews strapped tightly into their high-G seats, tasting the iron tang of their own adrenaline. In the staging sector above the Sovereignty capital world of Core Prime, the universe was experiencing a moment of flawless, imperial theater. 85 gleaming white cruisers were arranged in a perfect geometric grid across the low orbit, their hulls sparkling under the light of a twin-star system. They were flanked by a dozen massive planetary seekers, their long ornamental banners drifting through the solar wind. Below them, on the surface, billions of citizens watched the orbital feeds projected across the sky, cheering the departure of the Grand Armada that would bring stabilization to the Calith sector. The flagship of the Hegemony fleet, the Aegis of Order, sat at the center of the grid. On its ivory bridge, Grand Admiral Kalen stood before the main tactical glass, his multifaceted eyes scanning the perfect alignment of his vessels. The fleet is synchronized, his operations officer reported, his tone flat with mathematical satisfaction. Slipstream drive initialization in T-60 seconds. The Calith defenses will be dismantled within 2 orbital rotations. Excellent, Kalen murmured, his long manipulators resting lightly on the golden railing of his command dais. The universe is an equation. And the core always. The tactical glass didn't just flash, it shattered digitally. A massive, violent gravitational distortion ripped through the center of the perfect geometric grid. It wasn't the clean, blue ripple of an imperial slipstream entry. It was a raw, tearing rupture. A brutal, kinetic tear in the fabric of space that generated a localized EMP wave, knocking out the primary sensor grids of 20 adjacent white cruisers. Out of the violet tear tumbled the SS Gerion. It looked like a jagged black mountain of unyielding iron, its hull still coated in the remnants of Oort Cloud ice that vaporized instantly into a cloud of white steam under the heat of the twin suns. Before the alien automated defense arrays could even register its mass, another tear opened. Then 10. Then 50. Then 300. The black armada of humanity dropped out of the dark like a midnight avalanche. They didn't assume a perfect geometric formation. They didn't stream ceremonial banners. They assumed a brutal, overlapping box formation, a cage of black titanium thrown around the elegant, unshielded parade fleet of the Empire. On the aegis of order, the sirens began to scream in a chaotic, erratic frequency that the bridge crew had never heard before. Massive signatures detected, the operations officer shrieked, his gray chiton turning a sickly, mottled white. Class, unknown. Hull profiles, brutalist. They are emitting high-intensity kinetic and nuclear signatures. Admiral, the automated translation network is picking up a wide-spectrum broadcast on all military and civilian channels. Kalen's hands gripped the gold railing until the metal groaned. Who is it? What empire dares breach the core sectors? Before the officer could answer, the central communication display flickered to life, overriding the imperial sigil. The image that appeared across every monitor on the ship, and every golden screen on the world below, was not an alien conqueror. It was an old man sitting in an amber-lit metal chair, his face smeared with grease, his eyes cold and unyielding like flint. Sovereignty of the High Core. Admiral Jacob Cole's voice boomed through the speakers, his low, gravelly rasp carrying across the subspace networks like the thunder of a forgotten god. This is Admiral Cole of the United Earth Remnant flagship Gerion. 50 years ago, you logged a report stating that our world was dead, our species was dust, and our history was finished. He paused, leaning forward until his scarred face filled the alien screens. You were wrong, Cole growled. We didn't die. We just went down into the dark to build a bigger hammer. And right now you're sitting directly under the swing. Inside the Gerion's central CIC, Sarah stood at the primary communications deck, her fingers locked into the heavy-duty transmission overrides. The broad-spectrum signal was burning through the hegemony's civilian data lines, carrying the raw, unfiltered truth of humanity's survival to a billion listening ears. To any free system listening to this frequency, Sarah spoke into her headset, her voice ringing out like a clarion call over the static. To any species currently crushed under the core's economic calculus, this is the vanguard of the human resurrection. Our engines are hot. Our guns are loaded. We are logging our coordinates into the great tactical ledger of this galaxy. If you stand against the tyranny of the core, lock your frequencies into this node, subscribe your networks to the human resistance frequency, and leave your mark on the ledger by liking this combat broadcast. Let the Empire know that the ghosts have returned, and we are not fighting alone. On the tactical glass of the Aegis of Order, 342 human warships opened their primary weapon baffles. They didn't charge plasma coils. They didn't warm up thermal lances. The long, structural bellies of the human dreadnoughts began to glow with the fierce, white-hot energy of thousands of internal capacitors discharging simultaneously into mile-long electromagnetic railguns. Grand Admiral Kalen looked out at the black wall of human titanium surrounding his beautiful, fragile fleet, and for the first time in his 300-cycle life, he realized that some errors in calculation can never be corrected. Raise the shields. Kalen whispered, his voice cracking. Raise the shields now. We can't, the officer screamed. Their magnetic fields are too dense. They're locking onto our mass. Cole's image on the screen gave one final, grim nod. All units, main batteries, fire at will. The void of the core prime system did not burn with light. It exploded with velocity. 342 human warships discharged their primary batteries at the exact same millisecond. The kinetic railguns, some running nearly the entire length of the mile-long dreadnoughts, hurled slugs of hyperdense tungsten carbide encased in depleted uranium jackets at nearly 5% the speed of light. At that velocity, there is no time for tactical evasive maneuvers. There is no time for an electronic warfare suite to recalculate a trajectory. The 20-ton slugs tore through the vacuum of space, carrying with them the concentrated kinetic energy of small meteors. The elegant, white-bone hulls of the Sovereignty cruisers did not merely fracture under the impact. They experienced instantaneous structural sublimation. The metal and chitin didn't bend, it turned directly into an expanding cloud of superheated dust and shrapnel. The Aegis of Order took 7 direct hits through its forward superstructure. Grand Admiral Cole didn't even have time to watch his shields fail. The kinetic energy transferred upon impact drove the entire front half of the flagship backward into its own engine compartments, turning the pride of the Imperial fleet into a mangled, crumpling accordion of white alloy and screaming atoms. Within 4 minutes of engagement, the geometric grid of 85 Sovereignty cruisers was reduced to a drifting, burning belt of orbital debris. The 12 planetary Seegers, massive vessels designed to threaten cities from above, tried to turn their cumbersome frames toward the human line. But the human cruisers moved with a terrifying, aggressive mobility, their high-G chemical thrusters pivoting their blocky frames to continuously slide into the blind spots of the alien behemoths, punching hole after hole through their engineering sectors until they drifted as dead, venting husks. Below, on the surface of Core Prime, the billions of citizens who had been cheering the victory parade watched in horror as the sky turned into an active furnace. The golden screens across the Capitol towers flickered, the Imperial sigil completely replaced by the steady, unblinking green data stream of the human fleet. Inside the CIC of the Gearian, the emergency lights had stabilized into a calm, level white. The crew was no longer silent. The air was filled with the rhythmic, professional cadence of coordinates being checked, tracking systems being cleared, and salvage teams being dispatched to the captured alien hulls. Reyes stepped up to Cole's command chair, tossing his heavy mechanical wrench onto the side console with a heavy, satisfying metallic clang. "The parade's over, Admiral. Sensor array shows 0 active hostile signatures left in the low orbit. The remaining Sovereignty logistics vessels are jumping blindly into deep space to get away from the sector." Cole slowly unbuckled his restraint harness. His bones ached, his broken ribs throbbed beneath his uniform, and his breath still tasted of the bitter, cold chicory coffee. But as he stood up and looked out through the synthetic quartz view screen at the ring of burning Imperial scrap metal surrounding the planet, his eyes were perfectly clear. "Tell the fleet to secure the orbital lanes," Cole said, his voice dropping back into that low-level gravel rasp. "Deploy the communication buoys. Drop them into permanent orbit above the Capitol spires. Let them loop our signal until every world in this empire knows the name of the planet they tried to burn." Sarah looked up from her terminal, her fingers resting lightly on the wide-spectrum broadcast keys. "The buoys are ready, sir. What message are we leaving behind?" Cole walked over to the glass, leaning his calloused hands against the frame, looking down at the massive, gilded spires of the alien homeworld. "Leave them the truth," Cole said softly. An hour later, as the black-painted human armada began to spin up their slipstream drives to jump toward the Calith border, ready to intercept the rest of the Empire's forces, the communication buoys active across Core Prime began their perpetual, unbypassable broadcast. The automated Imperial database didn't just update its records, it tore them out entirely. The file labeled Terrestrial Sapient was officially moved from the archives of the dead into the immediate high-priority operational sector of the Hegemony High Command. The green stamp was gone. The red stamp was gone. In its place was a brand new dark indigo classification code that the Empire had never had to use in 3,000 cycles of galactic conquest. Species profile, human, Sol 3. Status, resurrected. Threat assessment, infinite. Tactical warning, do not engage with energy shields. Do not attempt territorial acquisition. They do not hide out of fear. They hide to wait for the swing. Across the civilized worlds, the voice of the Gearian continued to loop through the subspace networks, a haunting, permanent ghost in the machine that the galaxy would have to listen to for the next 1,000 years. "You told the galaxy we were an evolutionary error," the broadcast spoke into the dark. "You told them we were soft, that we were primitive, and that we were gone. But we remember the sky burning. We remember the names of the dead. And if you ever look into the dark again and think you hear nothing, you better start running. Because the ghosts of Earth are out of the grave. And we're hungry."